everybody, and thanks for joining Moms on a Mission today. We would love to share with you the incredibly effective and toxin-free skincare line we have found with Organic Body Essentials. Our friend Vicky Natali is a like-minded believer. She actually has an engineering background. She invented a device and she sold a device to a pharmaceutical company. And then she also at the same time was seeking and looking for a clean, toxin-free skincare line. And so she created one. She actually made it in her kitchen sink. No lie. That's the truth.
We have pictures to prove it.
Yeah, we do. And so we met her and we just loved her product. She sent us a massive box with 34 different products. And they're just so clean and toxin-free, and they're just affordable. And so we would love for you, if you like what you're hearing on the show, if it's blessing you in any way, we would love for you to support our show and support a fellow patriot by purchasing some products. She has some lip balm and lots of other things. If you go to organicbodyessentials.com and type in the code MISSION at checkout, you'll save 5%. If you order over $50, you get free shipping. So organicbodyessentials.com, code MISSION. And also, we would love to hear from you. We get emails from all over the nation. It's so fun. Julie and I will text each other and go, oh, we got another email from Nashville or from California. And we just love hearing your feedback. If you'll email us at moms@momsonamission.net, that's moms@momsonamission.net. And then you can check out our website at momsonamission.net. And just a little feedback here. If you're watching us on YouTube, we're so grateful, but we have 2 hits and strikes against us. And we've been told that if we have 3, that we're banned forever. And we're just going to perceive this as a badge of honor. But we also don't want to just show up missing one day and be MIA. So if you will also follow us on Rumble, that speech is not censored at all, but we're pretty sure we're going to get banned permanently on YouTube, and we're okay with that, but we don't want to lose you. So if you'll go today to Rumble, if you're watching on YouTube, go to Rumble today and follow Moms on a Mission. We would be so grateful.
Well, our guest today is from Dallas, Texas, and he is a best-selling nonfiction author. In 2020, when COVID was spreading across the U.S., he began to question how the medical and government officials were responding to this virus. Later in 2020 and again in 2021, he came across several videos of Dr. Peter McCullough, where the doctor spoke about the benefits of early COVID treatment and the prevention of hospitalization and death. Since this time, these 2 brave men have collaborated on a very important book entitled The Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalization and Death While Battling the Bio-Pharmaceutical Complex. It is our distinct pleasure and honor to welcome Mr. John Leake. Hello, John.
Hey, John.
Hi, ladies. Thanks for having me.
And right away, I'm going to show the book.
Yes.
Because we will be talking about this book today, and we want to encourage our audience to buy this book. It is amazing information.
It's astounding.
It is. And you will want to read it from cover to cover.
I think, it's important. I know this looks like a long book and it has how many chapters, Julie?
46, but they're small.
Yeah,
right?
They're small.
Yeah.
And that's the neat thing. Like right before bed, you could crank out a chapter, but information is power. Knowledge is power. And that's why it's so important to read and just stay educated and do a little something every day. But it's called The Courage to Face COVID-19. And I know we can say, oh, well, that's over, but really it's just the beginning. And we need to know the tactics of the enemy to be able to be prepared to fight, because it's not over. There's going to be something else coming down the road. So John, thank you for joining us today. Before though, we talk about your book, please give us a little background in case some folks don't know about who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm a nonfiction author, as you introduced me. I've focused on true crime. In fact, I'm working on a true crime story right now that takes place in Oklahoma, or part of it takes place in Oklahoma. So anyway, more on that the next time we meet. Okay. But I grew up in Dallas. I went to college in Boston, and then I spent several years kind of wandering. I lived in Europe for about 15 years. But my family has always been in Dallas. So I was back in Dallas at the beginning of 2020 when I began to read reports, first coming out of Wuhan, China, and then out of Milan, Italy. I've lived in Italy, and I'm very fond of the Italians and the country and the culture. So I was paying very close attention to what was happening in Italy. And I just began to notice that a lot of what our public health authorities and what our media, our mainstream media was telling us, to me, it just didn't really add up. there are a number of things that just seemed implausible, illogical. For two of the true crime books that I'd written, I'd spent quite a bit of time with forensic pathologists, forensic scientists, forensic pathology. We sometimes think of it on these shows like CSI, trying to determine the cause and manner of death. And so I had become quite acquainted with autopsies and how the cause of death is determined, how do we know and study what kills people. And one of the things that came out of Italy quite early, I think it was March the 16th, 2020, was the first autopsy study. The Italians were quite brave to do this. And what they concluded was that COVID-19 illness posed the greatest risk to the elderly, people who had perhaps even exceeded life expectancy and were suffering from comorbidities. So it became evident to me that quite early, this probably is something that has what doctors would call a risk stratified illness. It poses a risk to certain groups of the population which need special attention and protection, but not to the entire population. So that was my first suspicion. Why is this being represented to the public as though everyone, including young athletes, need to be terrified of it? Schools need to be closed, churches need to be closed. So that was sort of my first suspicion. And I began to think this could be a true crime happening, starting with distinct elements of fraud. Fraud is oftentimes a part of any criminal enterprise. And so that was the beginning. And I quickly realized I need a true medical scientific authority to work on the story with me, someone with real medical credentials, not just journalistic credentials. And so I got into touch with Peter McCullough, who lives about 2 minutes from me here in Dallas. Yeah.
Did you know that at the time?
I did. What happened was, I think it was Halloween 2020. I remember it was a beautiful, crisp October day, and a friend of mine sent me a link to a YouTube video, and it just said something like, "Have you seen this guy?" And I looked at the video, and at first glance, it was kind of odd because Peter was not at his then University Medical Center. He was like out on a jog in a park, and which had kind of an intriguing element, because I thought, okay, he doesn't want to be making this video at his hospital, because as we discovered during this period, the hospital systems were the first to impose this strange censorship and mandates. And so I began to think, here's this ranking academic doctor here in Dallas who has just made some discoveries that could be very useful in terms of early treatment of COVID, but he's apparently not at liberty to talk about it at his institution. So he's doing it, in a park, on his kind of on free time, making these videos. And so that was kind of my first clue that he is on it and he's researching it, but is having to do so as something like a dissident doctor. So I began to follow Peter, and then I saw his a C-SPAN video of his Senate testimony about 6 weeks later. I think that was November the 19th, 2020. He gave a testimony in the U.S. Senate about early treatment. And that's when I began to think, okay, I'm going to contact this guy. And so we met for dinner and started talking about doing a book together, and the rest is history.
Well, the book is amazing, and there's so much to cover that we won't be able to cover everything today, but we do want to highlight a few things. And I think it's very interesting that you're a true crime author. I didn't even think about that till I read your bio and read the book, and I thought this works perfectly together.
It's a perfect storm in the best possible way.
One of the largest crimes against humanity, COVID-19, and all the things that go along with it, and then a true crime author. Okay, so that's
pretty cool.
You and Dr. Peter McCullough, great combination. So I'm really glad that God put you guys together to write such a great best-selling book about COVID. I was talking with another guest earlier. I think a lot of us, people say, why do you keep talking about COVID? And it's over. And like you said earlier in the broadcast, that it's not over. And for many of us, we got to prepare for the next thing, and also to heal from what happened, to go back and look and examine a little bit closer about what happened. Why do I feel this way? Why do I feel like I have PTSD? Well, it makes it very clear in this book why, and we're not crazy. And Dr. McCullough was one of the first people, maybe like you, John, that I was like, he is taking a stand, a strong stand. Where are the rest of the doctors? So going right into that, going right into the book, you talked about some brave physicians, and I'm not even going to try to I know you'll be able to pronounce his name, but the French professor and physician, and then Dr. Zelenko from New York. We talk about that early on in the book. Can you tell them, I think a lot of people don't know about these doctors who were trying to sound the alarm, trying to say there are some, ways to prevent COVID from causing death. And what was the significance, and what did they do early on in the pandemic?
Well, I think it's important for the audience to remember that SARS, this severe acute respiratory syndrome caused by a coronavirus, we'd seen something like this already. I don't know if people remember, in the years 2002, 2003. It emerged in China in 2002, and it made its way to I think 4 other countries in the course of 2003. The Americans were somewhat distracted by the Iraq War, which started at about the same time as SARS arrived. So that was kind of the beginning of what Peter McCullough and I call the Bio-Pharmaceutical complex. It's this large complex of international foundations. You've heard of some of them: the Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. These are institutions with huge amounts of money. They operate in multiple jurisdictions all over the world, and they form these, what they call private-public partnerships with government institutions. This complex became very interested in coronaviruses, which historically we had thought of as causing things like the common cold, very mild respiratory syndromes. But with this first SARS that came out of China in 2002, the complex began to think, well, now we have what appears to be virulent coronaviruses. And, perhaps it's just a matter of time before another one comes out of China. So, lo and behold, 17 years later, we've got another one. Well, there was a professor in Marseille, France, named Professor Didier Raoult, and he is an infectious disease specialist. He's probably the most eminent in all of history. I mean, he's literally discovered hundreds of bacteria, viruses. He has come up with the standard of care for multiple viral infections. He's a true genius. And he quickly began to do some research on coronaviruses. How was the first one in 2003? Were there any kind of treatment modalities that were discovered for that one? And what he discovered was already back in the years 2004, 2005, I think 2006, and then there was another big study in 2012. There was a discovery that hydroxychloroquine had an antiviral effect on these coronaviruses. Not only an antiviral effect, but I think a lot of your viewers may be aware that hydroxychloroquine is used for rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, which are inflammatory autoimmune conditions. So there's an anti-inflammatory component to hydroxychloroquine as well. So Professor Raoult, who would know, I mean, he's the most eminent infectious disease specialist probably in the world. He says, look, we can actually treat this thing. It's not a silver bullet, but it's sufficient to keep people out of the hospital. And that's really what we want to do. I mean, if people could stay at home, get through the syndrome, get well without having to go to the hospital, then they may feel lousy for a couple of weeks, but that's still a big win. And very, very quickly, what Professor Raoul discovered was, the gates of hell opened on him. He was not allowed to talk about this treatment modality that he was discovered, that he developed based on previous literature and was using with great success at his clinic in Marseille. So that's kind of the opening of the story. And naturally, it raises the question, well, why would anyone want to suppress the treatment of this? Well, why? It's so strange. I mean, so I'd say that's kind of the opening of the mystery.
That's fascinating. Well, the title of the book says Battling the Bio-Pharmaceutical Complex. And in chapter 30, entitled The Best Disguise is the Truth, you take a deep dive into the corruption of the U.S. healthcare system. Will you define the biopharmaceutical complex? That's kind of like, we've heard industrial medical complex before, but can you define that and how it's affecting our country, just day-to-day families and so forth?
The origin of the expression, it actually goes back to the year 1961. President Dwight Eisenhower, when he was leaving office, following in the footsteps of a long tradition going back to George Washington, he gave a farewell address to the American people. And a president's farewell address is always kind of interesting because it's the one moment he's leaving, he can kind of say what he wants. This is it. It's like, if I'm going to shoot from the hip to the American people, it's now. So he warned, in spite of being a great military man himself, he was the Supreme Allied Commander not once, but twice. Once during the Second World War and then a second time in Korea. He said, look, I'm pretty concerned about the rise, the undue influence, power, money, power that is accruing to what President Eisenhower, called the military-industrial complex. And his warning is a fairly straightforward one. You get these military industries. The military is an institution, millions of men under arms, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, and they have this relationship with the U.S. federal government that is funding them to the tune of billions, tens of billions, now hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And what Eisenhower warned about is, while these guys are purportedly in the business of protecting the American people from foreign threats, their interests and influence have gotten so huge that they seem to, this complex, as he called it, has sort of come unmoored from democratic government and processes. And so what we worry about with the biopharmaceutical complex is that it's basically an offshoot of the military-industrial complex, where there's this recognition that at any given time, there could be an infectious disease that emerges somewhere in the world, and it could come to America, and it could threaten the American people. So we, pharmaceutical companies, foundations, Mr. Bill Gates, you need to give us money, power, influence, surveillance ability, electronic, to manage the next pandemic. The concern that we have is the same that President Eisenhower had in 1961. There's so much money and power in this that the question then becomes, well, maybe you guys really want an infectious, because that's where the party happens. I mean, if it never comes, for example, if you're a vaccine manufacturer, if there's never a new infectious disease that emerges and poses a threat, then you don't get hundreds of billions of dollars of federal grant money in order to develop your new product. So I think it's quite similar. And what we observed during COVID is it's the best business model, certainly in the history of mankind, because not only did the U.S. government fund the development of the COVID-19 vaccines, the U.S. government pre-purchased all of the vaccines, did all of the marketing for the vaccines, assumed liability under the PrEP Act for the. So, nice work if you can get it, if you're part of this biopharmaceutical complex.
And you guys do such a great job of laying that out. I mean, you can't see my book, but audience, let me tell you, I have highlighted and flipped pages because, and I would just kind of have to put it down sometimes because I was so angry, but you laid it out very perfectly, timeline to make you kind of understand the background of the biopharmaceutical complex and this relationship between the government and pharmaceutical companies and, you know, people like you said, like the Bill Gates Foundation and other large foundations, and just even words out of the mouths of these people that don't line up. They don't line up for what's the best interest of the American people and their health. And when you have COVID treatment that can prevent death, you do it. As Dr. McCullough would say over and over and over again, we as physicians, our first job is to do no harm. And when they were telling people, and I was one of them, when I left and had a positive COVID test, and they said, well, sorry about that, you know, come back when you're blue and can't breathe. That is the first time I'd ever heard that from a doctor. And I thought, well, that's strange.
Same.
No Tylenol.
I was told the same thing.
Yeah, nothing.
No.
And then Dr. McCullough got on and said, hey, we have some, he's the first, I didn't know anything about Dr. Real from, or however you say that, from France or Zelenko or the other doctors that were doing the same kind of work and trying to sound the alarm. But when he said, we do have treatment, and maybe they're off market or it's not for COVID, yeah, but this will work. And so it just, if you're wondering, audience, about the history of that, you need to read this book because it'll make you a lot smarter for the next go around.
And when you listen to John speak about how hydroxychloroquine was used for these other disease states, and, you know, when we talked about ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine and just the negative propaganda, I mean, you talk about all these institutions in place, the marketing, and then the media was just pushing all of this narrative and lying and withholding information so that,
well, then it goes back to, and I guess maybe you could speak on this, John, but it just goes back to, you know, Rogan and Tucker, you know, letting Dr. McCullough come on. Do you know any more details about those interviews? Because I thought those were really life-changing for me to hear Dr. McCullough speak on Rogan and Tucker about basically the biopharmaceutical complex. I didn't know what that was before then.
Well, what Peter knew from, I mean, I think he's published something like 600 peer-reviewed, you know, medical papers over his career, is that, well, first of all, if you're faced with an illness that could hospitalize or kill somebody, you try and do something early. You don't, I mean, for as long as we've had something like scientifically based modern medicine, I mean, it's just long been understood. You try and get on top of something early. Once the patient is so sick that they have to be hospitalized, then managing it is much more difficult. Diseases tend to follow distinct stages. So once you get to the end stage where they require intensive care, I mean, now you've really got a big problem on your hands. So you want to intervene early in the disease progression. And what Peter realized, just reading the literature and talking with doctors in the field, is these drugs, which are FDA approved, they've been around for decades. I mean, ivermectin is interesting because the inventors of ivermectin won the Nobel Prize in medicine in the year, I believe it was 2015, for curing river blindness, which is a parasitical worm that attacks, I believe, the retina, which had been this huge scourge in the tropical world for centuries, causing blindness in middle-aged people. And so suddenly what was known as a wonder drug for humans and animals, it does have veterinary applications as well, is suddenly just crudely labeled horse paste. And, you know, don't take this, it's dangerous. Ivermectin may very well be the safest drug on earth. There have been studies performed by Merck, which was the original laboratory that developed it, like 10 times the dose of what you would normally take it for river blindness with almost no toxicity, not even pupil dilation or any kind of characteristic signs of intoxication, nothing. I mean, it's a very, very safe drug. So you know that there's some kind of propaganda campaign going on here. The question, and Peter understood this, Joe Rogan understood this. I mean, he had an intimation of this. So did Tucker Carlson. But the question is, why? Why the suppression of these off-label treatments? Why? And what we discovered when we went back and we looked at the documents, the pandemic planning simulations, there's a whole range of documents that this biopharmaceutical complex has generated over the last 20 years. The decision was made years ago, the next big pandemic, we are going to optimize this opportunity. And in the literature produced by, for example, an institution founded by the Gates Foundation and the World Economic Forum called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, actually issued a business plan in 2017. And the business plan explicitly states, another viral disease pandemic is coming. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And when it comes, CEPI is going to have the following business plan on how to deal with it. So go ahead and invest in our business plan, planning for the next pandemic. And if you read that document, which is about 65 pages, the entire response of the business plan is a vaccine. Doesn't make a single mention of the word treatment. So it's like, imagine a guy who was once a monopolist in the software business, like Microsoft Windows, and he wanted everyone to use Microsoft Windows. And the United States Department of Justice actually went after him, under antitrust law for being a monopolist. Well, now the monopolist gets into the business of pandemic response, but his monopolistic tendencies are not in the software business, they're in the vaccine business. So these guys, they have, I would say, a doctrinaire, almost a religious attachment to vaccines. What this means is that early treatment just was not in the business plan.
Well, you say religious attachments. I'm going to segue into another part of the book that I thought I'd like to highlight for our audience about a very personal encounter between Dr. McCullough and his pastor, Andrew Forrest. This meeting took place before his, I think you mentioned it earlier in the broadcast, his U.S. Senate testimony back, I think, in November of 2020. And this highlights, I think, the spiritual battle surrounding COVID-19. And I think a lot of people, maybe shy away from that, but your book doesn't shy away from that topic. So could you maybe tell us a little bit more? What could you add to this as you research the book about the spiritual realm?
Well, I mean, Dr. McCullough has always been an adherent of the Christian faith. He goes to church every Sunday. He had a close relationship with his minister. But at the same time, he is, as a physician, as a researcher, he has made a distinction between the natural world of medicine and research and science, empirical science on the one hand, and the spiritual realm of the fate and destiny of humanity, and why we're here and where we're going and our relationship with a higher being. So I would say that Peter is both the religious man and a scientific man. He's interested in both the natural world and the spiritual world. And he was just so puzzled by the way what is purportedly the scientific medical community was responding to this pandemic. And when we go through this in the book, I mean, just the immense amount of effort that was made to impede him, to block, censor, prevent, bully, fire him, sue him, only because he wanted to treat his patients. I mean, it's not like any of his patients were complaining. I mean, on the contrary, all of them were saying, thank you. I feel better. Thank you, doctor. I was in real trouble a few days later after treatment commenced. I feel better. So Peter begins to ask himself, why would our medical institutions, our US government institutions, why would they go through such trouble to prevent me from simply adhering to my Hippocratic oath to help my patients? Like, what kind of world are we in? What has happened to our world? And his minister said, look, doctor, you're just going to have to come to terms with the fact that there are moments in human history when evil prevails over good. Evil gains the upper hand, malevolence, a desire to hurt, a desire to retaliate, begins to seize the hearts and minds of men and women. And the pastor said, I believe God has chosen you as a vessel through which the light can shine. And instead of darkness, fear, malevolence, greed, desire for power, through you, God can shine forth as patient, loving, helpful, serving mankind rather than trying to exploit mankind. So that this was his pastor's message, and Peter wasn't exactly sure what to make of it, but it was certainly a hopeful message, and it helped Peter, and it helped his wife, Maha, who has really had to endure quite a bit of turmoil as well. Remember, they were all set up for a very pleasant retirement with laurels and prestige and social status here in Dallas, but just because Peter tried to treat his patients and to spread the word of treatment, he was fired from his institution, sued by his institution. It's quite an outrage. It's a rather shameful moment in human history. I think that a lot of our fellow man is going to have to do some soul searching on this one.
Well, when you think about physicians, the medical framework that they use is obviously first do no harm, but the benefit should outweigh the risk. And that's just common in medical care.
Yes.
The benefit, you hear that all the time with physicians when they're making choices between different medical modalities and therapeutics. They use that word quite a bit when you have two choices that can cause harm or have nasty side effects. They want to keep that and the proper framework. And I think the fact that the first do no harm and then the benefit outweighing the risk, I mean, it's just like you were referring to, it's just illogical what they chose to do. And for me as a Christian, I see this and I align with his pastor and with Dr. McCullough. And I believe that the Bible says that the love of money is the root of all evil. And when you couldn't make money with Microsoft and monopolizing there was lots of money to be made. And you just see that if you look at any type of corruption, it's the love of money is the root of all evil. And that's what I see taking place here. And I just wanted to ask you, I know that your book, like Julie said, is very comprehensive. What would you, why do you think readers should buy this book? And what are you hoping for them to ascertain? What is like maybe a main thought or two that you're hoping they'll ascertain from the book?
Well, we believe that the COVID-19 pandemic, starting with the fact that's become very abundantly clear to anyone who will open his eyes and his ears, starting with the fact that this virus was made in a laboratory. I mean, that's kind of a problem for starters. And, starting with the fact that the virus was made in a lab, and then it was inflicted on us. And then, our businesses were closed, our schools were closed. It is a massive crime from start to finish. what I think that people need to understand is it's just another example of an out of control alliance, unholy alliance of unaccountable government, the United States government and all of its agencies, that have become unmoored from any kind of representative democratic control. The US government, in my view, has gone completely rogue. And it has formed these alliances with corporations. The alliance benefits corporations because the United States government is no longer subjected to any fiscal discipline. The US government just creates trillions of dollars out of thin air. So if you don't have any fiscal discipline, if the government can just say, oh, we'll make another $1 trillion and we'll distribute it to our friends, our lobbyist friends, our industry friends, the corporate interests that give us money for our reelection campaigns. If we have another crisis, some sort of military thing in Europe or an infectious disease thing, good. We'll give these guys trillions of dollars. So the problem is this has created a prevailing set of circumstances in which this unholy alliance of uncontrolled government and corporate interests want crises. They don't want peace and order and prosperity and harmony among nations, because there's no money in it. We want a pretense for weapons, for innovative pharmaceutical products. So we need threats in order to keep this whole racket going. I'm not saying that there aren't real threats that emerge, but usually they're not of this world is ending scope that our media and our government propaganda organs want us to believe. Usually these things can be managed by prudent, innovative citizens like Dr. Peter McCullough. We don't really need Anthony Fauci and the NIH and all of these huge government. And I mean, Professor Didier Raoult and Peter McCullough and Dr. George Fareed and those three men could have probably managed this problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. That's and what you're speaking of, I think the smoking gun is when there were preventative measures that could be taken and they were silenced, they were shut down, and they were made to look, or they were trying to act like they were crazy and call the horse pill. I heard that. In fact, I talked to somebody about taking ivermectin, like, well, they use it for horses, and I'm just not really sure. And I mean, their propaganda machine was incredibly effective. But for me, yes, there are legitimate pandemics, there are legitimate sicknesses and things like that. But man, the smoking gun to me is when you give them assistance, you give them medical care that could legitimately help prevent them from going in the hospital, and they silence you and they discredit you and they remove you from that conversation so that you can't help people. I mean, I don't need to hear anymore. I mean, that's pretty obvious.
Well, and you bring up such a great point that, whether it's with medicine or other things in our government or education, because on Moms on a Mission podcast, we talk a lot about education. But when you let bureaucrats and the swamp, or, that's the first thing I could think of, the funny name, but the swamp, the bureaucrats, the people that make their political career, their lifelong career, that's a huge problem. You're putting power into the hands of people who really don't care about your kids' education. They really don't care about your health. They care about their pockets and their dinners in Washington, D.C. or wherever they get to go. So I think this book is so critical for people educating themselves about what happened during COVID, what's continuing to happen in our government. And with an election year coming up, I don't know, sometimes it feels like a lost cause, but as we say here, we're not going to give up. We're going to keep fighting for families. We're going to keep fighting for our nation. And I'm pretty sure that's how Dr. McCullough and you feel, John, right?
Well, I would encourage everyone who has children to go back and educate their children into the founding history and institutions of this country. And I mean, remember, the whole idea of the American experiment in the late 18th century was the American people, well, at the time they were subjects of Great Britain, are a prudent, self-reliant. I mean, we were out here on what then was the edge of an empire, a frontier, pretty much looking after ourselves. I mean, Parliament in London was 5,000 miles away, and yet the American subjects of the British Empire who lived on the East Coast of the places like Boston and Virginia and New York, were doing a pretty good job of taking care of themselves. So that conditioned the founding of this country, that we need government. Government kind of provides a legal framework, a set of rules. We need law enforcement because there are some members of society are dangerous and predatory. We need some protection, something like a militia, an army of some sort to protect us should a foreign power invade. But the state is something that we need for governance, but we should always remember and never forget that politicians are humans too. And just as criminals in civil society or ambitious military officers or bandits or whatever can be predatory, so can the government. And the men that framed our Constitution understood that government is necessary, but government needs to be very carefully defined and very carefully limited.
And that's exactly why we had checks and balances. I mean, while you were speaking earlier on the show, I'm glad you brought up the educational component and the foundation, historical foundation of our country. I mean, this is so ironic to me. It's not lost on me that this is what we were running from. This is what we were seeking to avoid in America, was running from these tyrannical forces and seeking religious freedom, medical freedom, just freedom at its fullest. And now look where we've come. I mean, I just can't even believe that we're fighting the same battle that our forefathers were fighting.
Yeah.
I think we are. I think we're engaged in the same. I mean, I have developed such a attachment to James Madison, the author of the Constitution. I mean, everything he wrote about, every letter, his speeches at the Constitutional Convention. I mean, he's warning, okay, we're creating a government, but with the government, we need to define it. We need to limit it. We need to define its powers. And these powers should never be superseded. There's always a temptation of government to say, well, the circumstances are particularly dangerous right now, so you need to give me more power, more money, more power, more military. And then I can take care of everybody. Of course, the other question that this raises is not only should we believe that government should have more power, the other question is government particularly competent at problem solving? And I find it's really not. I mean, people that go into government tend not to be problem-solving people. If they were, they probably wouldn't go into government. They sort of like to have their photo taken and sort of be on C-SPAN or whatever, but they're not. I mean, and I tend to avoid partisan attachments, but I mean, President Biden has never done anything but hang around Capitol Hill. I mean, he's never done anything but hang around Capitol Hill and just give speeches. And so the question is, and I'm speaking practically, not in a partisan political way, are these people really the most suitable for problem solving? And I believe the record indicates they're not. Government is more likely just going to screw something up rather than solve it.
Yeah, I would
Well-
say the evidence stacks way against them being the problem solvers. And I think of what Ronald Reagan once said. He said, the scariest thing is, I'm the government and I'm here to help. That's one of the scariest things that you can hear. And I would agree with that. And it hasn't changed, but gotten worse.
Well, and we've talked about this and hit on this all throughout our conversation today. And that is, I mean, if they help too much, I mean, they don't want to work themselves out of a job, right? So they have to have good job security. And so, I mean, what's the benefit of helping when, you know, maybe they can't make as much money or they don't have as much control. So, I mean, let's just call a spade on that one.
Well, John, yeah, go ahead.
Just one last thing. I mean, government, in order to expand its offices, its privileges, its payroll, its everything, its tax authority, government needs for the citizenry not to be managing its own affairs. So in a weird way, government needs dysfunction, mismanagement, dependency. There's nothing that government wants more than people that don't take care of themselves and their children and their communities. Because if everyone took care of themselves, their children, educated their children, people were well brought up, well-mannered, minded their own business, obeyed the law, there'd be no reason for government. I mean,
they couldn't indoctrinate them I mean, that's why public school started. If you read Battle for the American Mind, just a plug for Pete Hegseth there, but that book was brilliant in exposing the Marxist agenda way back in the late 1800s when they came over. I mean, that was the whole goal of public education, was to get God out and to start indoctrinating children and students. And that was the way to do it, was through the school system. So yeah, they are trying to usurp the parents and the families and enforce government control in any way possible.
Well, to come back around, I want to one more time talk as we wrap up. To remind the audience about your book, The Courage to Face COVID, Preventing Hospitalization and Death While Battling the Bio-Pharmaceutical Complex. John, where is the best place to purchase this book?
Well, probably the easiest thing for people who are already in the habit of using Amazon is to go on Amazon.
Okay.
Delivered the next day. For people who, and some of our readers are queasy about using Amazon, you can buy it directly from our website, couragetofacecovid.com.
Okay. And you guys, you and Dr. McCullough are also working on a Substack. Tell us a bit about that. Courageous Discourse. Yeah.
Yes, the Courageous Discourse Substack with Dr. Peter McCullough and John Leake. Every day we post on not only medical public health issues, but foreign policy, education. I mean, we find that a lot of these themes and the way they're being handled are quite similar. For example, to mention a somewhat inflammatory topic, we are finding that this ideology of gender transformation of, you know, suddenly little girls can become little boys and little boys can become little girls. It's similar kind of biopharmaceutical complex at work. I mean, we see the same institutions, the same foundations are pushing this, and then the government is actually providing the funds for all of these ghastly surgeries and procedures, which cost a fortune. A lot of people don't realize that if a family had to pay for a gender reassignment on their own dime, this could never happen. I mean, these procedures cost millions of dollars, and it's the US government that's providing the funding to do it. So that's just one of many things that that we're writing about. And Dr. McCullough is approaching this from a real medical standpoint. I'm looking at it more as a true crime investigator. The elements of fraud and deceit and manipulation that we're seeing, and the way it's being communicated.
Well, we had a show with Dr. McCullough, and we spoke about that and the autistic element of it all and how they're preying on autistic children. And we also just spoke with Chloe Cole. We have a show with her on it, and I sent Dr. McCullough a text, and I was like, you are absolutely right. She she was thinking she had autism, and the doctors told her she was too high functioning and too smart to have autism, and then pushed her down this transgender path, and just flat out lied to her and said if she didn't have a double mastectomy, she'd be suicidal. So, I mean,
It was a crime.
It was a crime. And I think, and I just have to say to you, you know, just like we say that Dr. McCullough, that this was maybe his God-given destiny and his calling to walk this path, you know, I believe that you also, this connection with him was a divine connection because of your background and writing these novels about crimes. I mean, this was something developed in you for such a time as this. Esther 4:14, you know, maybe you were called for such a time as this to meet him. And I just think it's really neat to watch God bring about his plan among mankind to help the world. And so I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have learned a lot from you. I know our audience will absolutely love listening to this show later on this week. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, ladies, for having me. If I could just add one thing, kind of a positive piece of news. Dr. Peter McCullough has been working away at dealing with this complex that we've been talking about for the last 3 years. He's had a number of philanthropists that have come to him and said, look, you should start a foundation, you know, with an institution. You could hire people to help you, whether it be research assistants, film production people, executive assistants, to help you really build your knowledge and your mission into an institution. So I'm pleased to announce that the McCullough Foundation has been founded. We have 501c3 tax-exempt recognition. So donations are tax deductible. It could really, really help take this from just kind of a one-man band Peter McCullough show to an institutional support. So if maybe I could send you an email with a link to the McCullough Foundation.
Yeah, we'd
Send
like
us
to
your
add
link and we
that.
can add that. And is it McCullough? What is the website for that?
It's McCulloughFND.org.
Okay.
That's great. And that does provide a lot of hope, because I believe that will help us not be so reactionary, but to be more proactive. And I feel like it feels like we're always on our back foot, just reacting to these things. So, I mean, how great.
That's great.
And I really prayed for that, like that people would rise up and start investing and giving money just the way, you know, the left has, that we would, and not that it needs to even be political. It's just the truth. Let's just invest money in the truth and make decisions based on that.
Yeah.
So,
yes.
Well, we thank you for joining us today. And I know our listeners are going to love this show, and we would love to hear from you. If you'll email us at moms@momsonamission.net, or check us out on our website, momsonamission.net. And please follow us on Rumble. That's probably our uncensored. Yes. We hope by the time we get to this episode this week that we're not banned from YouTube, but if we are, we are. So
go to Rumble.
Yeah. And please follow us on your favorite platform.
Moms on a Mission is excited to partner with our friends at MyPillow. According to sleep experts and sleephealth.org, over 50 million Americans struggle to get a good night's rest. That's where MyPillow comes in. They make the best pillows, sheets, mattresses, and mattress toppers. Several years ago, I was having trouble falling and staying asleep due to neck and shoulder pain. Luckily, I heard an ad about MyPillow and decided to give it a try. After 3 or 4 days, I really began to feel a difference. I was sleeping better and my neck and shoulders felt so much better. MyPillow really does help you fall asleep faster and stay asleep longer. Moms on a Mission wants you to get a great night's rest too. Go to MyPillow.com right now and use the promo code MISSION for up to 66% off your purchase. MyPillow products are made in America and have a 60-day money-back guarantee and lifetime warranty. Remember, go to MyPillow.com, put in the special code MISSION for your special Moms on a Mission discount. Thank you and God bless.
Hey guys, it's Moms on a Mission here. Are you worried about your financial stability and protecting the money for which you work so hard? The problem is stock market volatility and inflation. You may be wondering what you can do to preserve your family's wealth. We at Moms on a Mission encourage you to reach out to our friend Andrew Sorcini with Beverly Hills Precious Metals. Andrew is the expert in educating you to help you find the right balance of gold and silver for your family portfolio. He made it so easy for me to add precious metals to my financial investments. I simply mailed a check to Beverly Hills Precious Metals and my silver showed up on my doorstep a few days later. It was so easy. Go to bh-pm.com to save a little money and tell them that Moms on a Mission sent you. That's bh-pm.com. Don't wait. Protect your wealth today by going to bh-pm.com and tell them that Moms on a Mission sent you.